And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in the webinar this afternoon. This is the fourth part of our webinar series, working with Minnesota local governments to increase access to healthy food. And I just want to note a couple of partners who are making this webinar possible. The Blue Cross Blue Shield Center for Prevention, the Minnesota Department of Health Statewide Health Improvement Program, the Minnesota Extension and SNAP-Ed Community Partnership Project, the Mitchell-Hamlin Public Health Law Center, and Terrasoma are strategic services firms specializing in food systems. So I just want to note that there are some federal funding making this webinar possible, and this non-discrimination statement guides some of the work that we are doing. I am going to introduce myself. I am happy to be with you moderating my second webinar. I am the Healthy Comprehensive Planning Coordinator with Terrasoma, again, a strategic services firm with a specialty in food systems. Prior to this, I was the program director at a very small nonprofit organization called Gardening Matters, which focuses on community organizing and urban agriculture policy. I have served on the St. Paul Ramsey County Food and Nutrition Commission for 5 years, and I've been working on changing policies to support urban agriculture and food access at the state and local levels for about that long. So I'm very pleased to be with you today. I want to review our goals for the presentation very quickly. We are here to talk about the definition and importance of equity and its application to comprehensive planning. We're here to understand previous impacts of comprehensive planning and the importance of this history to intentional, effective engagement with communities of color, and also to learn concrete strategies to build equity into comprehensive planning processes. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists. We have three wonderful presenters today. Our first presenter is Dr. Fernando Berger, who is an assistant professor for the Masters of Urban and Regional Planning degree program at the Humphrey Institute at the University of Minnesota. His research deals with equity in urban planning, particularly in relation to the incorporation of immigrants. And he combines planning history, ethnographic fieldwork, and design techniques to evaluate how planning addresses immigrant life and to show how immigrants can engage planning to assert their agency, build political power, and mobilize planning agendas. He holds a master's degree in architecture and urban design from the University of Miami and a PhD in city and regional planning from the University of California, Berkeley. And he's going to kick us off. Before we hear from Fernando, though, I'm going to just introduce briefly the other two panelists that we have. Michele Curie, who's the manager of public involvement at the Met Council. And Michele oversees outreach, writing, and editing staff in the communications department. She is a former journalist and has worked for more than 15 years specifically in public engagement, communications, and public relations. And she has experience at the Minnesota Legislature and the Minnesota Department of Public Safety prior to joining the Met Council's outreach team. In the 8 years she's been with the Met Council, she's helped guide the agency's outreach program to focus less on traditional methods and audiences and more on authentically engaging the community and key stakeholders in decision-making processes to create shared outcomes and shared responsibility to achieve more equitable outcomes. Michele was born and raised in the Twin Cities and holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Minnesota in journalism and Latin. And then Meg Beakman has been the Community Development Coordinator for the City of Hopkins for the past 3 years. And in that role, she manages long-range planning activities for the city, including the Southwest Light Rail project and related development. She also oversees public engagement activities related to community development. She loves the city of Hopkins so much that she recently purchased a home there and has managed to convince her city-loving and car-hating husband to come with her. Prior to working for the city of Hopkins, Meg worked in Arden Hills as their city planner. So we've met our presenters. Now I want to take a minute and look at who is in our virtual room today. If you could take a minute and describe, select the category that best describes your role. We have a brief poll here. And I like to ask who's in the room today because I want everyone to know that even though you're sitting at the computer and listening, perhaps solo, there are around 140 people who've registered for this webinar around the state. So there are quite a lot of people who are here that are interested in this topic who are listening with you. We have just a couple of minutes, or a couple of seconds left, and you can see the breakdown of who's in the room today: planners, public health representatives, citizens, community advocates, nonprofit representatives. Looks like we have a good mix of folks. So thank you for being here and for answering that question. I am going to turn it over to our first presenter now, Fernando.
Thank you, Nadia, and thank you so much for this great introduction and for allowing me to share this conversation with you and others, the other panelists in this conversation, online conversation, and as well, thank you for all of you that are joining at this time in the middle of the day to embark on this dialogue. The presentation that I'm going to share with you today, the section which comprises a small part of the longer work we're going to be doing, is called Beyond Historical Trauma, Claiming Equity in Urban Planning. And it's really meant to sink in the question of history and to allow us to acquire a historical lens to understand why the city is the way it is today, and how do we as individuals, planners, nonprofit advocates, resident citizens that move around the city, live in the city, how we can actually find a way to move forward together in order to reimagine possibilities that guide us towards equity. So this is going to be a historical presentation, but I wanted to start with a statement that is very much part of the public imagination. It's a statement by President Obama during the ceremony, the burial ceremony that occurred last week in Dallas for the police officers that were killed in a horrible act of violence. And that statement is, but in America, we know that bias remains. We know it, whether you're black or white or Hispanic or Asian or Native American or Middle Eastern descent. We have all seen this bigotry in our lives at some point. We've heard it at times in our own homes. If we're honest, perhaps we've heard prejudice in our own heads and felt it in our own hearts. We know that, and while some suffer more under racism's burden, some feel to a far greater extent discrimination's stain. Although most of us do our best to guard against it and teach our children better, none of us is entirely innocent. I wanted to start with this statement because this is a hard statement to swallow. I think for me it is, for sure. It is hard for all of us to swallow, but it's important to face this reality. It's important to face this reality when we think about our cities. It's important to face this reality because we are together in this webinar today because we're facing this reality. And that's something I want to put on the forefront. The material that I'm going to share with you is difficult material to understand and to fathom and to digest. But it is a reality, and it has to do with how we carry on our own biases today as planners, nonprofit workers, activists, advocates. It's how we move and work and live in the city. But we're here because we are willing to move forward and engage that discussion in a productive manner. In many ways, this is a discussion about how we can reimagine the future rather than stay embedded with legacies that very much are about the past. To do that, we have to understand our past, right? And we have to understand how our cities reflect this bias that President Obama mentions, and what can we do about it. So in many ways, I'm going to be sharing this material with you not from a position of paralysis, because this is hard material, and I don't want this material to become a source of becoming frozen, but basically a force of taking action. And towards the end of this presentation, I'm going to share with you some general ideas of what you can do as an individual and as a group to be able to move forward. And the other case studies and the other speakers that are in this presentation actually have excellent examples of how do we move forward in that direction. So to think about this problem of bias or this problem of history, we have to have an outline. And the outline that I'm going to give you is thinking about the American city as historical trauma, particularly through the experience of African American populations. This is very particular, and I'm going to explain that in a minute. Then we're going to look at the history of urban planning in racial inequality, which is very much part of that history, that process of historical trauma. We are responsible and have been responsible for that, and we need to take new action moving forward. Then I'm going to share with you a couple of slides that look at principles of quantitative work, quantitative analysis work, that many different types of folks can do by looking at the census. This is one way to move forward and to think about how do you build partnerships, come together in new ways, create new scopes, and share knowledge. And then we're also going to look at principles of qualitative work, which have to do with notions of how do you check your own racial identity, how do you think about your own white privilege, and how do you embark upon a path that is about racial literacy. This is a fairly broad presentation, so I'm going to move fast. There's a lot of material, but this is basically an introduction, which I hope creates new discussion. And obviously, at the end and after this presentation, I'm always available and willing to share and discuss these topics with others. So when we think about the American city as historical trauma, this may be something of a new idea, because for many of us, the city is not a historical trauma. It's a place where we enjoy, where we go, we hang out, we live, we partake, et cetera, et cetera. But when we think about historical trauma, we really have to think about the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over a lifespan and across generations emanating from massive trauma experiences. This has particularly been dominant in the African American community in American cities in the United States. Trauma has created distance, distrust, and disconnection, and now we're really at a threshold in a way, at a moment when we have to think about new ways to reconnect, to reconstruct, and to come up with new meanings. The history of planning and racial inequality and the way that historical trauma has occurred throughout this history has been well documented. It's not a surprise, it's not a myth, and it's actually the result of concrete and specific planning policies that have shaped our cities, the way that cities were designed, built, the way that infrastructure was allocated, the way that funding was channeled into certain locations, and also the way that we have become American, and we have actually assumed racial bias in the way that we choose where we live, the way we choose where we go, the way we choose the places that we avoid. So in many ways, like I said before, this is a historical argument, but it's very much about how that history shapes our present. The layers of this history have to do with racially restricted covenants, housing segregation, highway construction and urban renewal, and land use restrictions. All of these become layers which in many ways define how the American city is today and how many of us live and move through the American city. So when we start very early on, and this could be a very long conversation, but I'm going to specifically stick to the 20th century and look at specific policies. It should be a very long and complex discussion. From the 1920s to the 1940s, you had the emergence of racially restricted covenants. A covenant is a legal enforceable contract imposed on a deed on a buyer of a property. This was a contractual agreement that prohibited the purchase or lease or occupation of property by a particular group of people. And during those times in particular, it was geared at African American populations in particular. Nationwide, it was used to prevent people of color from purchasing homes in mostly white communities. The actors of this were property owners, real estate boards, and neighborhood associations. Very much a systematic approach happening at the local level in which many different actors were part of this discussion. Here we have an example of one of those restricted covenants, which basically really clearly has terms like Negro blood, any person of Semitic race and blood or origin, racial description that includes Armenians, Jews, Hebrews, and Persians. And then that was not only a document that was within the deed, that was also explicitly portrayed through marketing material and signs that attracted people to particular communities. So on the right, you see a sign that says, "This track exclusive and restrictive." That implies directly what that meant. These documents are from Washington, D.C., the one on the left, and the other one on the right is from L.A., but these cases occurred throughout the United States in many cities. We actually find them today within the Twin Cities. I did a little bit of research this weekend and found several municipalities that had this particular tradition in place, and arguably they also existed in many other municipalities throughout greater Minnesota. So arguably there's a lot of work to be done to recover this history and to understand what it meant to patterns that exist today. The next process, or the next line of this inquiry, was housing segregation, and this actually was a process that was part of the Federal Housing Administration institution, which institutionalized racism. During this process, mortgages were denied according to race and ethnicity. There was a manual, an underwriting manual, which established the FHA's mortgage and lending requirements. And there were policies that actually were great for people who were white coming back from the war that allowed them to go to suburban neighborhoods in the outskirts of the city. They actually were geared for white people to actually be able to obtain mortgages and settle on the outskirts of the city, but they were also very detrimental for people who couldn't access these mortgages. And this was part of a very intricate process that is called redlining. Some of you may know of it, have heard of it, which was a mapping process which limited financial services to neighborhoods based on racial or ethnic composition. You may ask, well, how does this look like? Well, this is what this looked like, particularly in our Twin Cities. Here we have redlining maps from Twin Cities in 1935 that were developed through the FHA and also supporters and allies. And the red zones are zones that are deemed dangerous, or zones where you wouldn't invest, or you would not be able to, that you would not be deemed being able to have a mortgage. The yellow zones are zones in transition, and the blue zones were the zones that were mostly risk-free. You see these patterns happening in neighborhoods that today are concentrations of African-American people and people of color, Native American and Latino folks. Same patterns happening in the city of St. Paul. If we compare these maps to the way that racial concentrations exist nowadays, you immediately see the same patterns repeating themselves. So this is the racial dot map, basically 1 dot per 100 people, 1 dot per person in the Twin Cities. And it really, if we go back and forth for a second, you can really immediately capture how these patterns repeat themselves. This is basically because these initial systems of segregation through racial covenants, FHA loaning practices, and other practices that were described really embedded people to a place. People couldn't move, people couldn't buy property in other places, and arguably it was a system of segregation which is very much part of how we not only conceive the center of cities, how we conceive public housing, but also how we conceive suburban areas, suburban outskirts throughout our American city. Moving forward, this was part of a larger process that later, with the suburbanization of the American city, people moving to the suburbs, mostly white people, was accompanied by another process which involved highway construction and urban renewal, right? And this process was geared around housing, jobs, and population moving to suburban towns and newly created highways. Suburbanization magnified the effects of segregation by increasing the physical separation between whites and people of color. Highway projects destroyed middle-class American communities. So this is one very emblematic chapter in this history of the American city historical trauma, in which highways were directly built over African-American neighborhoods that were vibrant, which were safe, which provided people of color, African Americans in particular, with sustenance and livelihood. And therefore, because of the constructions of these highways, many of these communities were displaced, divided, and housed in public housing complexes. This is a very complex and intricate history, and now, then again, I'm just moving rapidly through this to give you a quick vignette of what happened. But it was very much part of how we conceived our cities. Here we have a map of St. Paul, which is actually a composite map, which is a map of how social scientists during the 1920s and 1930s came together to think about and imagine different groups living in the city. So I'm quickly going to just draw something here we have here the area today, which is recognized as the Rondo Frogtown neighborhood. And you can see how the expressway was directly built on top of that neighborhood, which in that time had the label of Negroes and calling out African Americans, which today is obviously a politically incorrect term to use. But this history still remains today. Infrastructure that took place through historical processes doesn't disappear. It still divides community, it still drives housing prices, and it still is a historical trauma which affects specific communities of color throughout American cities. Here we have the construction of that highway, the I94 Highway, and you can see how much time, energy, expenditure, and arguably mess that construction highway produced, right? So this was a process that for many communities outside the core, the central business district, was a sign of mobility, a sign of modernization, a sign of better living, a sign of better housing. But for African American folks that lived in the center of this community, actually it was a nightmare and a trauma. The same thing is happening with Minneapolis. Once again, we have here the denomination of slum, and we see the construction of the highway happening right through the center. And this, once again, was a process that replicated itself throughout every American city in very unique ways. And every chapter of every history of American city has this experience and denotes this traumatic event. From 1970s to the present, there's been changes. It will be very difficult to get into the details of how these things have changed, but the civil rights era brought new awareness and new needs. In response, for the growth of suburbs, local governments enacted new zoning regulations to control density, protect open space, and promote redevelopment. One of the big things that we still see today is that multifamily housing is seen as a threat because it generates insufficient tax revenue and offsets costs. And people generally want lower density, right? So single-family housing is something that is seen as an amenity, something that is good, is something that culturally is embedded with our society, and people of color not always fit into that mold. They may have extended families, they may have families that extend multiple social networks, multiple places, and many times homeowners may feel threatened by multifamily housing, which is also conceived as public housing coming through their neighborhood because it starts to affect property values. So this is an example of how the bias actually exists today and how historical trauma is a platform that then articulates some of these biases that today we experience. Housing discrimination is another big factor. You know, I don't have to go very much into details about how people of color face discrimination in their attempts to rent, purchase, and finance homes. And there's been many audits in many cities throughout the United States that constantly and once again showcase this disparity. People of color are usually shown fewer homes. They're told about fewer listings. They're asked more questions about their qualifications. They're steered into other communities, and they quoted higher loan rates. So this is an ongoing issue. History is not just something that delves in the past. It's something that articulates our own values today and the way that we operate and the way that we move, we build, the way we live in cities, and it's something that we have to be very aware of. I want to leave, and I have a few more minutes left, with a couple of suggestions and comments about how do we move beyond this historical trauma. What do we do? How do we move from the paralysis? And as I mentioned, the case studies that come after my presentation represent stellar experiences on how planners and people on the ground, different types of folks, can come together to reimagine this point of historical trauma. So I'm going to leave with a couple of slides and then with a little plug for urban agriculture. The first slide talks about principles of qualitative work. And, you know, this is something that in the nature for planners is very important and something that we're becoming more and more aware, that the city is not just about data, it's not just about the representation of data, but it's about engaging people with that data. and engaging people with questions that have to do with social justice and equity. So, the nature of planning social justice and equity is fluid and dynamic, right? And it also changes. It's case by case based, and that's something that I really want to emphasize. There's no one normative model or specific solution or silver bullet on how to do that. You have to come up with diverse methods to attract diverse populations. And you have to be willing to experience discomfort when you go out and work with people. You have to be okay with making mistakes and moving forward because you will make mistakes. You have to engage racial literacy, which is a lifelong journey for every single individual in our cities, not just white people, but also people of color. There is a lot of discussion on white privilege that needs to emerge, and we need to think about that and how do we bring that into conversations that have to do with planning. You have to think long-term and always return to the location that you're working with to show longevity. You have to be honest, transparent, and accountable. Always check your position. It's not just about you. It's about things that are seen and unknown in front of you. You have to find allies and forge relationships, and this is perhaps one of the most important things together with engaging racial literacy. And don't just extract knowledge. Don't just come and take and use it for a report or a finding or something that will move forward your professional career. Share that knowledge. Find ways to co-author. Some ways to reconfigure that power that goes into the production of knowledge into new ways, and foster spaces where people can come together and share contributions. That is very important. In terms of quantitative work, it's important to consider that there's very specific tools that can be used to gear demographic analysis towards a more equity-based approach. And basically what this asks is to apply categories of census and American Community Survey data, which is accessible, which is visible, which you can go online, to actually harness certain categories that then start to point at equity issues, specifically segregation, poverty, housing, unemployment, borrowing, retirement savings, wages, class mobility, et cetera, et cetera. These are categories that you can combine, you can map, you can share, you can digitally represent, you can visualize, and you can actually share, like I mentioned from the previous work, in order to really generate new conversations about equity and find and identify scopes. I want to finish with a specific call, and this is, I have to say I'm biased about this. I have my own bias. But I believe that urban agriculture and food security in the Twin Cities is a very important site to discuss and think and reimagine historical trauma and think about all these things. Because the topics that we deal with, urban agriculture and food security, and I'm starting research on that, are very much about equity. And they have to do with issues of land tenure, for example, who owns that land and how that land is productive. How that land is geared around local and global chains of food commodities, and what does that mean for us as consumers. It's about urban and rural relationships, not things that are happening just here in the cities, but connections with populations, underserved populations that may be living and engaging in rural communities. It's about the public and the private, right? It's about public-private partnerships. It's about also tweaking development towards new approaches, perhaps, and asking more from development. And it's also about individual biases, individual assumptions, but also individual ways to reinvent yourself, to practice your own ethos, your own identity, to do that collectively with others, and to share and to do new things together. This notion of connecting with the land, and I know of some people who are talking about land connectors. I'm going to give a little plug to Metric Giles in Rondo, who may be here right now, who talks about land connectors, and that term becoming so important when we think about urban agriculture. Is very important to think. Those types of terms give us food for our imagination to rethink and reconsider how we do our practice into new realms which are about reconnection, reconstruction, and new meaning for historical trauma in the American city. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fernando, so much for that very thoughtful analysis. I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker, Michele. And Michele, I think we are ready for you.
Great. Thank you all for the opportunity to talk a little bit with you today about how the work that we're doing at the Metropolitan Council relates to this discussion about equity and inclusion, particularly around the methods we use to engage our communities in our planning and decision making. First, just a quick FYI on what we do at the Council. For those of you who aren't in the metro area, we are responsible for the major planning for systems in the region that include transit and transportation, wastewater and water resources infrastructure, so long-term sustainability in our water supply system. And we are the agency that all the local governments in the region who have to put together comprehensive plans need to send those plans to, so that we can make sure that they're consistent with the regional infrastructure that we have in place or will have in place over the long term. So we're involved in all of these elements, and the state law requires the Metropolitan Council to put together a regional plan that sets out a sort of framework and guidance around policy and specific development outcomes related to the region and how it will develop moving forward. So the slide in front of you shows the cover of that regional plan that was adopted in 2014 now. And there are several other plans that flow out of it, but the reason that this is so significant is because this plan for the first time really recognized the fact that a lot of the things that Fernando was talking about, some of the historical disengagement related to policies that government put in place around people of color, and where infrastructure was created in ways that specifically disconnected people from other amenities in this region. And, you know, that history is deep, and that history has impact. And it in large part, has led to communities not really trusting government processes, and certainly not, you know, regional long-range planning that feels pretty squishy and is sometimes really hard to get your hands around. It has a little bit of a difficult, we have a little bit of a difficult time trying to make that tangible for folks, because it doesn't necessarily relate to something that comes right in front of their house every day. So this plan actually took the approach that I think a lot of communities are taking, and that's really awesome that this is happening, where we're looking at a longer-term vision for what we want our communities to look like in the long term. And that needs absolutely to engage audiences that typically aren't engaged in these processes. And sometimes we find ourselves, when we're planning, really thinking about the stuff and the data and the maps and the information that we know, and that's all wonderful, but it needs to be paired with some of the qualitative things that Fernando was talking about that really relate to the lived experiences of people in their everyday lives. And if we aren't comparing those two things and confirming what the data tell us, then we're missing a really important piece of the puzzle. And that was the message that we got when we went out with our long-range plan, and heard from a number of constituencies across the region, from government to nonprofit sector to service providers to just people who live and work in our communities, saying, you just don't have a way to really tap into that reality, and we don't feel like your processes really reflect the values that are important to us. So the Thrive MSP 2040 plan, which is the current regional plan, really tried to take into account that this is a values-based exercise. This is something that needs to resonate with people, and it really has to call out a few specific goals that are pretty important to everyone. And those specific outcomes are in front of you. There are 5 of them, and you'll notice that equity is one of them, and it's the first time that equity has been called out in one of our regional plans as a specific need in relation to how we plan and how we implement those things. So it's got both a long-range planning impact as well as how the council does its work kind of impact. These 5 outcomes are supposed to live in balance with one another, but it's important to call out equity because it is definitely the first time that we've actually engaged with that. Among the specific things identified in the Thrive MSP 2040 plan, in the equity outcome is the notion that we need to engage more authentically and more fully so that people are actually participating in the decision-making processes in a tangible way. And it's not just about engaging the full cross-section of the community, though that's important. It's about collaboration and consultation in a way that makes these decisions not just about the Met Council's decisions, but that they reflect community values too, and they're shared decisions. And one of the things that we heard loud and clear from community folks, including Metric Giles, who Fernando just mentioned, was that we need to be more conscious about making decisions with people and not just for them, and certainly not to them, which is the case that was done in many cases, the legacies that we've left in this region and some decision making. So, and the really major piece of this too is to develop lasting relationships. It's not about just going for one project and talking to folks and then moving on. It's about building an expectation that there will be a long-term relationship there. And in many communities, this is not hard to envision. You are seeing people every day that you know you live near, that you work near, that are part of your surrounding area, and those accountabilities are important, that we're making sure that we're engaging folks in a way that when we run into them on the street, we know we can feel pretty good about what's been going on. The other thing too is that it specifically called out that we needed to put together a public engagement plan. Now, I will be the first to admit that the council is the kind of agency where we like to plan and talk about planning and do all kinds of discussion about things that aren't necessarily right here today. But it's really important that when you are planning to be intentional and to articulate clearly what you're hoping to achieve with something, because that sends a clear message to community folks and to the leaders in your areas that this is what the expectations are. And when that is done together with community, it really has a power, and it helps people participate in your processes much more effectively. So I just really encourage folks, as they're thinking about these things, and it feels like, oh, we write all these plans and they sit on the shelf. I assure you this is not a plan that's going to sit on the shelf, and it is absolutely something that we're thinking about every day when we're doing our work. Again, it's about planning for people and for our communities and for the key elements that relate to the daily lives of those folks. Even if it is a long-term consideration, it is absolutely about them. And I just like to remind us to keep that in the forefront. So just a little bit of data, because it wouldn't be in the council if we didn't have data. We are going to, by 2040, have significantly more older adults, so people who will be living longer, and there's a big chunk of them that are going to be coming into that age 65 plus category there. And that requires us to be thinking more inclusively about people of all abilities when we're trying to make sure that the services and the infrastructure is going to meet those needs. But the other thing that is even more obvious here is that we're going to have more than 40% of people of color more than 40% of our population being people of color in the region. And if those people aren't engaged in our processes, and they weren't certainly before this plan was created, that was pretty obvious from if you've done a demographic breakdown of the people who participate in our processes, then we're not actually planning for a community that they can see themselves in. And that was something that we needed to change. So this new plan really focuses on engaging folks in planning, engaging them by respecting that they have experiences that are relevant to the decisions that are being made. We needed to make sure that we're responding more to the needs of community and not just assuming that we knew what those needs were. And then needed to be transparent in that a lot of times I think people, especially when they don't trust government anyway, they feel like all kinds of decisions are made behind closed doors that they don't have access to, and we need to change our processes so that even if that's just a perception, it's not a perception that rings true for people. So then the other really key philosophy behind this was to listen, to learn, and adjust. So a lot of times, like I said before, we have data that tell us things, that tell us, with a fair amount of certainty how conditions might be in communities, but if we aren't actually asking people who are affected by our decisions what they think or how they might want to be involved in that decision, it's really difficult to know. And so it's a constant process of asking, listening, learning, and then adjusting our approaches to make sure that they're responsive to those folks. The council regional plan also calls for a convening role where we might bring folks together around issues that spread across the region but don't necessarily have something that they're asking the council to do. It could just be something that they're asking government to be conscious of generally. And then again, this principle of nothing about us without us, making sure that we are engaging community in elements that really affect them. So the creating this plan was a collaborative effort in and of itself. We had monthly meetings with folks who were part of a region-wide effort called the Corridors of Opportunity Project. If you're interested more in the Corridors of Opportunity and you're not familiar with that, I'd be happy to explain that to folks at some point, but it was a region-wide effort that brought a number of partners together due to a $5 million grant that we got from the federal government around equity and planning along transit corridors that had been identified in the region. And what was awesome about that effort was that it designated a big chunk of the $5 million, $750,000, to go directly to community engagement. And the partners that were part of this effort created this steering committee to disperse that money, and it went directly to community to do engagement. And the lessons learned in that process were powerful and important. And what it told us was that community has a lot of capacity to talk about planning, and they really need to be engaged in that process. So as part of this collaboration, we created some shared definitions for engagement and some principles for engagement. To not make my very long story any longer, I will make a brief comment that the council was also going through some equity discussions at the same time. And we were able to line up the principles and the shared definition of engagement with the community discussion. So it was a very concurrent and collaborative process in that way. And that helped a lot too, because the council members were participating and able to see that the expectations that they had were also playing out in community expectations. So these are the principles that exist today in our public engagement plan. And I'll just make a couple of brief comments around them. They're pretty self-explanatory, but I think the key pieces are that it's really important to keep your decision-making processes open to allow folks to not only observe that, but to invite them in and to share the opportunities to really make decisions. It's hard sometimes because, especially our elected officials, they feel like they were elected to make decisions, and that is absolutely true, but it is really important to make sure that the community is also reflected in those decisions that are being made. And that really requires, to some degree, sharing an agenda, sharing problem solving, and really understanding how you can bring people into decisions, and that it won't necessarily slow things down, it won't necessarily change the outcome, but it makes it something that community can see themselves in and take it and talk about it and become advocates for it and become, you know, really engaged and engaging in talking to others about what's going on. And that is really powerful. When you don't have to be the only one talking about your stuff, it's really great, because that just extends the value of the work that you're doing in really, really important ways. And the only other thing that I would call out to you is that the pieces about inclusion and cultural competence are really about removing barriers to participation that you might not realize are there. A lot of times in our planning processes, we have a few public meetings, we might have some in-depth discussions, but we put them in places and at times that are good for the organization, they're good for the government, but they aren't necessarily good for the community, and we still expect them to come and participate in those processes. And it might not be a good time for them or whatever, and the attendance is low or whatever, or the room that you've convened does not really reflect broadly the community that you're trying to deal with. It's really important to ask yourself those questions when you're setting things up, and try as best you can to go and be where people are and meet them on their own terms and to tap into their existing interests rather than trying to figure those out and configure your work around something that that reflects your priorities and your timing. It's just really important. A case in point, we had a discussion with some folks in the Latino community, and we were asking them, would you come to a public meeting? And they said, well, where we come from, we don't expect to be consulted on transportation decisions. They just happen, and the infrastructure appears, and it just is. So when they come to the United States, they don't necessarily expect that someone is going to consult with them, so they don't look for those opportunities to participate. It's really important for us to know some of these things and to have some competence around that cultural phenomenon and just make our processes work so that we can address those kinds of barriers. Just want to put in another plug that this is really about building relationships and elevating voices that have not historically been involved in processes or are not reflected in your processes as you're moving forward. And you really need to be looking at that so that you make sure to bring that in. I'll start wrapping up here. One of the things that we did for staff in order to help them understand, what to do and how to be more inclusive in processes was to create some real resources for them to use. We have a checklist that folks can walk through. We are constantly reminding folks that it takes time to engage community, but it doesn't necessarily take more time. It's just being intentional and bringing those folks into processes early. And honestly, these things are truly scalable. I know that the Met Council is a large agency. We represent the full 7-county metro area, but we use this practice on small projects and large projects, and it is possible in a 1 or 2 person community development department or planning department in, a small city to actually engage this way. It's just about building a long-term expectation with community that that's how you're going to do things, and things fall into place when you have that. The other thing, too, to remember is, we all like data. We all like to know how we've been performing. Largely for engagement, it is a qualitative measurement process. So back to Fernando's slide about all of the things that, from a qualitative perspective, matter, you need to be ready to ask questions about what people experienced when you engaged them. Did they feel connected? Did they feel respected? Was the process easy to follow? Was it transparent for them? How to do all of those things. And that's really a key piece, because that tells you how people feel about the work that you're doing with them and the way you're engaging them. And so I would just really encourage you to be open to that. And as Fernando said about discomfort, sometimes you have to ask questions that you totally don't know the answer to, and that's okay. You're not supposed to know all of the answers. You're supposed to be finding the answers by engaging folks in that process. With that, I will stop talking and turn it over to the other panel.
All right, thank you so much, Michelle. Meg, I think we have your presentation loaded, and you can begin.
Great, thank you. Wow, Fernando and Michelle have really set the bar pretty high. And, I think I just want to thank everybody for being here. And, what I'd like to talk about is really some specific things we've done within the city of Hopkins around engagement and around planning for our community as we get ready to do our upcoming comprehensive plan and some other work we've done around light rail in the past few years. And I will say that, kind of just as a disclaimer, sometimes this work can be really hard, and we don't always get it right. I think with every single engagement activity that we do, we learn something new, we get feedback about how it could have been different, and we try to incorporate that into our future plans. And I think being humble is a really good way to approach it, because, sometimes I ask stupid questions, or I, don't think about something, and later on it becomes, obvious that it was something maybe I should have thought of. And so we just kind of need to roll with those and do the best work we can. And so that's a little bit my disclaimer as we move forward and I talk about some of these specific things we've done. So a little bit about Hopkins. Hopkins is a very racially diverse community. We're relatively small. It's 4 square miles, but we have about 20,000 residents. 65% of our housing is rental, and the vast majority of that is affordable, whether it's legally binding or naturally occurring affordable housing. Hopkins is designated as a racially concentrated area of poverty. And there are areas of the city that have more challenges in terms of that than others. And so we really try to approach our planning efforts with really kind of understanding the whole community at once. And so I think one thing that helps with that is we have a very supportive city council. Our council has three pillars that really guide all of the work we do. The first one is to preserve the hometown feel of Hopkins. The second is urban design, do it right. And the third is take it to them. And really that's about involving our diverse populations, engaging our rental community, and inspiring community engagement whenever we can. And because this is a goal of our council, our staff is really fully supported and encouraged to try new things and reach out in different ways to the community. And, you know, sometimes it works better than others, but our council has a lot of, gives us a lot of space to experiment, and I think that's been really freeing and allowed us to try some new things. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk about kind of three specific engagement activities that we've done, and then I have maybe an example of a few kind of like little creative ones we've done, and then really the bulk is kind of our lessons learned. So I will dive right in. The Artery Experiment was a project that we did last summer, and it was really a 3-day pop-up demonstration project. Thanks to the support of Blue Cross Blue Shield and Hennepin County Active Living, we received grants to put this event on. And essentially the city has a light rail stop that is planned. There's 3 in Hopkins, but one is the downtown Hopkins station. It's 2 blocks south of our Main Street, and Hopkins has a historic Main Street. It's really the gem of our community. We have a very walkable community, and one of the challenges is that the light rail stop is 2 blocks to the south of Main Street, and we really want to create this connection to Main Street. And for a long time, businesses have complained that our Main Street is too hidden from Excelsior Boulevard or 169, and we really wanted to open it up. So the Artery is our response to this need. It's a reconstruction of 8th Avenue. It's about 4 blocks in its entirety. And the primary feature of this reconstruction will be a 2-way cycle track that will connect 2 regional trails that pass through Hopkins, bringing those regional trails right through our downtown. It'll narrow the street, kind of blow up the pedestrian experience, and the whole project is really infused with a great deal of art, both just from the features and the installation of the infrastructure itself, but also having space for art rooms and creative and interactive art displays that people can really experience fully. And so this is a corridor that is, in a sense, ever-changing. We've got kind of rotating art, and also that we want the community to own and to have a sense of ownership over, that they can come and produce and experience art in a really unique way. And so we've partnered with artists in our community and the Hopkins Center for the Arts to do that. So obviously it's a big project for the city. It's an expensive project. We have a lot of funding partners to get this done. And so we decided to do this 3-day pop-up demonstration project where we were really going to try to recreate the elements of our artery on this street, let people experience them. We created these posters that explained each element and how we were copying it. And so we brought in food, we brought in music, we brought in games. We had a 3D chalk artist that recreated a Minneapolis Moline factory line that people could get their photo taken next to. So just to test out all these different elements, incorporating history into the project. We've talked about a photo ops. We wanted to have that. We had water features, lounge areas. We brought in a Three Rivers donated a bicycle fleet that people could use to test out the cycle track itself. And we really invited the community to come in and play with this space. We advertised the event very broadly. We hand-delivered invitations to all the apartment buildings in the downtown Hopkins area. We have over 1,200 units. We advertised on social media. We put posters up all over the community. And in the end, it turned out to be a pretty successful event. We asked people to provide feedback in a lot of different ways. So we had a survey that was mostly pictorial that asked people to identify which elements of the artery that they thought were the most important. We had a community table where we served ice cream and asked people to talk about their favorite places and why they loved them. We had staff. That's me there in the yellow sweater. Apparently I wear that a lot because that's also the sweater I was wearing in my bio photo. But anyway, we had booths set up kind of along the artery, and we had staff talking to folks throughout and explaining to them. You know, the whole event kind of had this sort of block party feel. We had food trucks and we had bands playing, but we also wanted people to understand that this wasn't just a typical, you know, kind of a crummy block party. It was you know, a community engagement activity, and so we spread it out throughout and let people really play with the space. And then give us lots of ways to give us feedback about it. And in the end, I would say it was fairly successful. We had about 2,000 people attend. We got a lot of amazing feedback. We had people come out to this event and that we were able to interact with that never would have come to an open house at the city or, you know, a night meeting at a council meeting to give feedback about this project. We were able to really interact well with the community. And for that, it was incredibly successful. Another initiative we have is the Hopkins Race and Equity Initiative, and this is a collaborative effort that is creating opportunities to increase awareness and understanding of race, equity, and diversity, and promoting a sense of community that welcomes and values all residents. And so this was put together by our police department. Specifically, it's led by the Hopkins Police Department, the Hopkins Public Schools, and some church communities within Hopkins got together and said, you know, we need to have a better discussion about race and equity in Hopkins, and we need to make this be something that the whole community can be involved in. And so the steering committee was formed, and they've been working for the last year or so on these items and have had kind of various initiatives throughout the community. And one of the big ones they had was this past May, they hosted a World Cafe-style discussion about race in Hopkins entitled, Let's Talk About Race in Hopkins. And we had about 250 people attend the event, and you know, it was really positively received by the community. We had people sitting in small groups, and there was a facilitator who led the discussions, and then people would get up and move around, so you got to meet a lot of different people. And, you know, just out of that event, we had a couple residents decide to start a Humans of Hopkins Facebook page. And so that's been gaining some traction. It's been a fun addition to the discussion online around really getting behind people, you know, your initial reaction to people, what's their story, and learning about our stories because we have so many amazing stories here in Hopkins. And so that's kind of one small activity that's come out of that. But the discussion at large, I think, is good. I would call it a small first step. Most of the attendees were white, though the people of color that attended kind of pointed out that, you know, they're kind of tired of talking about this and that it's white people's turn to have these conversations, and so they seem to think that was okay. But it has been, you know, I think a good way to begin that discussion. And we have more events planned this fall. Cottageville Park is another project that we worked on. This one was a multi-year project. So Cottageville Park is located within the city's most diverse neighborhood. It was a pocket park with really limited visibility from any from any roadway. It was really kind of blockaded in by buildings. High crime. It was not a place that most folks in the neighborhood felt was a safe place to take their kids. It was poorly maintained and just generally not a very pleasant or safe place to be. And so the city, along with the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District, because Minnehaha Creek runs adjacent to this area, decided to really make a significant change here. And so we started to acquire properties around the park, and particularly those that were very dilapidated or in very poor condition, and then a couple commercial properties that were vacant, and set about planning for this new park. And really it was a considerable outreach effort. We held numerous events both in the park and in the neighborhood to get residents to come out and tell us what they wanted the park to look like. We partnered with the school district to go into the school and specifically reach out to kids who lived in that neighborhood and were likely to be using the park. We went door to door and talked to folks. And then we also held traditional open houses, and the primary tool used to gather feedback was a map of the park, and then we had pictures that had, you know, a bunch of options for things that you could put in the park, and then people would cut out the items that they were interested in and place them on the map to show what they wanted the park to look like. And, you know, it was really low tech, but it worked really well. The kids loved this type of engagement. They were really excited about it and got it right away. And then also it worked great when we're working with communities that had limited English for them to be able to express their desires. So we, you know, then could photograph the pictures or bring them in, and it's very visual. I mean, they were really interesting to look at. The park had its ribbon cutting last October, and it is completed now, and includes tripling the size of the park, bringing it up to Blake Road, making it very visible and safe and well lit. And then we also added a permanent community garden. There was sort of a temporary one that had been placed there more informally by the community, and it became clear that there was a need for that and that the community really wanted it. And so as part of the reconstruction, we built an ADA accessible community garden that is now planted and has already begun producing harvest. So it's been a really fun thing to watch come to fruition. And then just some kind of random different events we've done. So for the Artery project, we held an open house in, we wanted to get out of City Hall, and so we have a brewery in Hopkins that's happens to be located on 8th Avenue where the Artery project is going to be constructed. And we held an open house there. And we got great turnout. People really enjoyed coming to a brewery to get information about the project. We had much higher turnout than we would have had if we'd had it at an open house at City Hall. And again, kind of new faces, folks we hadn't seen or we don't typically see come out to our events. So that was a fun little thing that we did. We held a Pechacucha Slam back in March of 2014 entitled Visioning Hopkins Main Street. So we asked community members to come out and give short presentations about what their vision for Hopkins Main Street was. We had about 80 people attend and about 13 short presentations. And then the attendees were able to go around and vote on the ideas that they really liked. But it was really community-led. So people could, you know, kind of get on a soapbox and pitch their idea, and then the community could vote on what ideas they liked best. And we're actually planning another one around our comp plan this fall. So we're going to have, what's your big idea for Hopkins? And we'll have a Pechacucha Slam and invite folks in the community to come and give their big ideas. So it's just kind of a fun and different way to engage people. We hired a poet to come. This was last weekend. We had an event in Hopkins, and we hired a poetry mobile. A poet came, and people would go and talk to her about what they loved about the community or what they wanted to see in their community, and then she would write poetry based on the conversation that they'd had, and then people could take the poetry home with them. She typed them out on these beautiful cards, and then the city, we were there and took photos, so we got copies of each of the poems. And it was something that the people that participated in, I guess something that was unexpected for me was that how valued the poems were. People really were excited, like they were getting something very special when they were done. It was something that people really valued. And then finally, right now, we're kicking off a Cultivate Hopkins, or that's the name of our comprehensive plan process, and we're asking people to submit a video of themselves talking about what they love about the community, upload it to their social media with hashtag #ILoveHopkinsMN, and then we're pulling those videos into our own social media, and then also using them as engagement around our comp plan. And we're asking people to submit the videos in whatever language they're most comfortable speaking in, and then we're having them translated with subtitles. So trying to make that really, really easy. And we also are engaging with folks throughout the community that have contacts within our diverse populations, and actually paying them to solicit videos from their friends and neighbors so that we can be sure to get a really diverse group of folks participating in the campaign. So just some of the things that we've learned as we have done this is to really use multiple ways of engagement, whether it's written, spoken, pictures, demonstrations, and to do it within the same event. So, you know, if you're having a traditional survey, have a chalkboard where people can, you know, write quick little things, or ask people to engage in just as many ways as you can think of, because, you know, sitting down and doing a survey might not be comfortable for everybody. You know, there's other ways that people can interact. Meet people where they are, and I think this has been a theme throughout. I will say this is a challenge. It's hard to do this. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources. Sometimes it's, you know, going to a movie in the park on a Saturday night that the community is putting on for themselves, and you know, walking around and meeting people and talking to them, or going to a farmer's market on, you know, Saturday morning, or visiting our community gardens on the weekend where people are hanging out and having an opportunity to chat. We're really lucky in Hopkins. We have this Blake Road Corridor Collaborative, the BRCC, this group that has formed that are different organizations that represent that Blake Road area. And there's a coordinator for that group, and she has organized this great series of events that she calls, they have a biking with friends, and it's just people in the neighborhood that get together and go for bike rides. They have a gardening with friends, and they get together and garden in that community garden. We have a swimming with friends that's specifically for Muslim women who want to learn to swim, but need to do so in a single-sex environment with female instructors and closed windows, and so they organize that, and they get together to do their swimming classes. And then we have a cooking with friends, which people can submit recipes. The coordinator goes out and buys the ingredients, and people meet at the school and get together and cook and talk. And it's just, you know, attending those is a good way to meet people and build relationships, but it takes time, and it's not natural. It's not natural for planners to do that. It's particularly not natural for engineers. And as we plan our infrastructure projects, it's hard to do that. So it's good to kind of do it all the time, so then you have the relationships already in place when you need engagement in a timely manner based on a particular project. Make it fun. Always make it fun. We add games and music and certainly food. Always have food, good food, and people will come. So I encourage that. Be approachable. Again, this is really challenging. We are trying to have our commissions and committees reflect our community, and that's been a challenge, but it's something we continue to strive for. Cultural awareness, just being aware of where people are coming at from. This was this picture on the left was a photo of city staff going out and participating in a cricket tournament with some Indian residents in one of our buildings. It's primarily Indian, and we played a game of cricket. And then building trust. I think we do that by by listening to people and then implementing what they have to say. So when the community, for example, we have a large plot gardens that people rent, and they wanted water at the community gardens. It seems pretty simple, but it was a bit of a process, and we were able to provide that. The design of Cottageville Park was entirely reflective of the comments from the community. So finding opportunities to talk with people during non-engagement events and building those relationships. So with that, I don't really have anything else. I will turn it back over to the facilitator. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Meg. I want to make sure we have ample time for questions, and just a reminder, if you have questions, please submit it in your Q&A window, and we will be facilitating questions. The final part of my part here is just to try and link some of this together with health and planning and equity and explore where those things intersect, and then provide some really concrete resources for everyone to be able to use. So I'm going to go fairly quickly through these last few slides in the effort to give us some time for Q&A. I'm going to talk really briefly about the Minnesota Food Charter, which provides a foundation for some of the food access work that has been happening. And I know we've talked about the Food Charter in previous webinars. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Food Charter was developed through a broad-based public participation project, and it offers a shared roadmap for how Minnesotans can have reliable access to nutritious, healthy, safe food. It contains 99 strategies that focus on changing policies and systems, and Minnesota is one of 5 states in the nation with food charters. And so we're taking the lead in the area of food and equity. So I want to bring that up because it provides the foundation for 2 other important resources. One is the Health Equity Guide, and this is a companion guide that was introduced with the Minnesota Food Charter to help people work on equity-specific strategies in more focused ways. So this Health Equity Guide is available online. I'll get to that, how you get that in just a second, but it offers helpful resources and information to implement equity-focused strategies. And it contains relevant definitions and concepts to health equity work, some compelling stories and concrete examples of systemic barriers, and some strategies to address these barriers, as well as some guiding questions and a resource list. So I want to just talk a little bit about why equity in health matters, and I have a link to this specific report in a later slide. This report was done by the Minnesota Department of Health. It is a report on advancing equity, health equity in Minnesota. We know that research reveals that who we are and where we live and how much we earn are some of the biggest factors in how likely we are to be affected by obesity and diet-related chronic diseases. And economic and social conditions can change our outcomes. We know that in Minnesota, we face a lot of challenges with equity and health. And compared to the rest of the nation, we know that our communities of color are not doing as well when it comes to our health equity outcomes. For example, in the Twin Cities, 26% of residents of color are in poverty compared to 6% of our white population, and this is one of the worst disparities in the country. People of color in the Twin Cities are losing up to 4.5 work weeks every year just getting to work using public transit, according to a new report that highlights racial disparities in Minnesota. So this means they have far less time to shop and prepare for healthy food, among other challenges. And we also know we have the worst or second worst graduation rates among states that report in all 4 non-white student categories. So we do have a lot of work to do. The Health Equity Guide talks about how people can, in community-based settings or local and state government agencies, start to work on strategies that will address some of these disparities. The guide includes a self-assessment tool for individuals, and it includes discussion guides and ways that diverse, inclusive partnerships can engage key stakeholders understand equity-focused concepts, and identify strategies to address root causes of inequities. Another important resource that we spent an entire webinar talking about is the Food Access Planning Guide. The Food Access Planning Guide is specifically designed to empower planners and healthy food advocates to work together to improve policies in our food environment. And it provides tools and resources and policy strategies, and it specifically provides some recommended planning and zoning language. So I would turn your attention to the webinar that is recorded, and that link will go out for more information on the Food Access Planning Guide. The Food Access Planning Guide also has an equity lens. It's really clear that healthy food access is a question of equity. And healthy food access was specifically identified as a social determinant of health by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I want to point you towards the Food Access Planning Guide Toolkit, which provides some concrete ways that you can use this guide in your communities and with the groups that you are a part of. The toolkit provides a checklist for an event host. It provides a sample meeting agenda. It provides an engagement guide, and it has a slide deck for you to be able to take the Food Access Planning Guide on the road and create some outcomes together with your communities. You can get both the Health Equity Guide and the Food Access Planning Guide at the links that are on your screen, and again, those will be sent out with the entire slide deck. And then there are two more slides that list some important resources that you can use in your community. The first one is the report that I just talked about, building the case for, the second link is Advancing Health Equity in Minnesota, the legislative report, and then building the case for racial equity in the food system. This is a report that shares an analysis of what it means to build a racially equitable food system, and it lays out some concrete steps toward achieving that goal. The Minnesota Health Equity Reports and Data Link is just that, lots of reports and lots of data. Building the Field for Community Engagement contains an organizational assessment tool. And then I wanted to include a link to the Implicit Bias Assessment tool, which is sponsored by Harvard University. This is something that you can use with your staff or with your community groups, and it could provide some interesting discussion for how bias is appearing and in our personal lives and may then color the decisions that we're making in our work. And then one final resource. There was a really excellent event in the Twin Cities this May. It was the Placemaking Residency, and the theme was Designed for Equity. And there's an online portal to most of the content from this placemaking residency. I would encourage folks to take a look at the presentations because it's really themed around all of the things we've been talking about today. And there are two links, one to the online portal and one to an article that you could use for discussion, How Thoughtful Design Can Reduce Racial Inequity. So apologies for running through that really quickly, but I did want to make sure we have some time for Q&A. Before we get to Q&A, I want to make sure you know the previous 3 webinars in this series have been recorded, and they are available on the website on your screen. These are also excellent resources for group discussion, or if you have a need for a speaker for a group, taking a look at the speakers that were a part of these webinars and being able to show them to a group. We've had some excellent, excellent speakers. We also have another webinar that's coming up in September 7th, that is on healthy food and safe food, using law, policy, and practice to move from either or to both and. And you'll be getting more details about those webinars. Okay, so now on to Q&A. I think, Fernando, I'm going to address this question to you. When you are thinking, you've talked a lot about the focus on historical trauma and its development and impact on communities of color. Can you talk a little bit how this might play out in greater Minnesota, specifically with tribal communities or new immigrants in communities that maybe have not seen very much diversity to this point?
Sure. So, you know, the concept of historical trauma is malleable and applicable to other communities. In fact, I think that if you look at the literature on historical trauma, one of the sources from which it emanates from is the experience of Native American communities worldwide. So in that sense, there is a very clear connection. When we think about Native American communities, how they have been placed in reservations and how they have been secluded and excluded from opportunities related to urban development, urban growth, amenities and infrastructure access, for example, things become really clear. I know, for example, one of my colleagues here at the Humphrey, Kathy Quick, is doing amazing research on transportation infrastructure and access for Native American communities. These reservations, these places where Native American communities tend to be located, are locations which exist in rural areas, unincorporated areas. They have their own governance and mandated system, its own territory, and within these locations, planning needs to happen, or planning hasn't happened. So there is a lot of work that needs to be happening there, and the connection with historical trauma can be very easily made, both from like the local experience of simply living, moving around, from the historical experience of the expropriation of land, from lack of opportunities to access growth and resources. It is there. The connection just needs to be made and talked about. In terms of immigrant communities, this is a great point, and thanks for bringing it forward, Nadja. So it is very interesting to think about historical trauma and immigrant communities in the U.S. And once again, this is a case-by-case specific issue, right? But you do have in greater Minnesota communities which are immigrant communities which have their own experience of historical trauma, one which originates from their country of origin that may involve crises, war, the refugee experience. It may involve histories which are not domestic American histories. They are about other places, other identities, other histories which are parallel and in many ways are related to also American history globally, right? So in that sense, there are these connections to be made. The Somali community comes to mind. The Hmong community also comes to mind immediately. You mentioned the incredible measures of disparity that exist in Minnesota as a state. If you are a person of color in this state, it is unhealthy for you to be here, extremely unhealthy to be here. We have the worst measure of disparities at many different levels: education, housing, accessibility, the most states in the nation. So the Hmong community is interesting because the Hmong community is part of this constellation of this family of Asian communities, Asian immigrant communities, which is actually very much part of our experience here in Minnesota, but it's also very low in those measures of disparities. So it is there. It's a matter of making the connections, not ignoring them, but actually understanding that they are part of where we live, also part of how people come here, and also how people move forward. We haven't even talked about Latinos and undocumented Latinos, which is another big question. These are folks that I work with in particular who live traumatic experiences their everyday lives because they cannot move, they cannot be visible, they're constantly under threat or being deported, and they're constantly facing circumstances that are beyond their control because they don't have the appropriate documents to be able to access or have citizenship. So that's another part, and this is one particular population when we talk about immigrants, which is very special, very particular from the other two. But it's also, they also experience trauma. They also experience challenges which define their everyday lives.
Thank you, Fernando. Michele or Meg, do you have anything to add to that? Either one? It's okay
no,
if the answer
I don't.
is no. Okay.
Yeah. No, I don't either. I think you said it all.
Okay, awesome. Maybe, Michele, I'm going to direct this question to you. And if either Fernando or Meg has a comment, you can answer after Michele. In a lot of communities, we know that we're going to see an increase in people of color, but those voices might not necessarily be at the table yet. Can you talk a little bit how communities might plan for that kind of increase when those voices aren't presently at the table?
Sure. I think that the key piece is to do some intentional outreach, either to communities that have trust relationships with communities of color or immigrant communities, for example, or to, you know, otherwise just connect. And some of the places that we've really found some success in trying to, you know, get into and to build some strong relationships with cultural communities is going to churches and going to faith communities and really connecting with folks on that level because, you know, for example, in Catholic education, there are opportunities where kids are learning something and the parents are there and they're not really doing anything, but they have to stay with their kids. So we've gone to some of those organizations and said, hey, you know, we have just some basic information about transit or about other things that are going on. Would you be interested, or would it be okay with you if we did that? And then they'll go and ask the parents or the other participants, and that way we have a sense of whether they're really interested in the information. And it's usually just pretty you know, general at the beginning, and you just begin to find areas where you have shared interests. But ultimately, you just have to go and start connecting with groups, and then you can build relationships. You don't necessarily have to worry so much about, you know, going through another group, but those groups are also great to build relationships with because they just have really great connections in the community, and they really have a sense of, get their fingers on the pulse of how things are changing and what's going on.
Excellent, thank you. Meg or Fernando?
I would just add, I mean, right, you need to be intentional about it, and we've found that the schools are a good partner to have. They know, at least in Hopkins, the Hopkins School District, they know, I mean, even down to when we were looking at a particular park, I mean, we were able to get access to kids and their families that were in that neighborhood. So we've got a good relationship with the school district.
I think I will follow up by sort of like proposing stepping back from the specific and asking more of a general question in response to your question, Nadja. And if I understand the question correctly, it's like, how do you plan for change, right? And particularly communities that will change with new immigrants. Is that correct?
Well, or communities whose population will look vastly different, or even majority.
Okay.
And those
Sure.
folks may not be in those communities right now to be able to talk about what they want in communities.
Right. So you know, I think it's important to consider that change is something that will affect all of our lives in one way or another, and that's a very difficult and deep discussion to understand what that means and what we hold on to and what we offer as things that are open for dialogue and transformation. I think that is an issue that we all have to think about. And I think it's very important within that question to ask, how will the leadership look like in the future? What would the leaders be? Who will they look like in city councils, at the municipal level, at the mayorship level, at the state legislative level? I think it's because the country is changing demographically in the next 30, 40 years, right? And it's not just Latinos, for example, it's Somalis, it's Hmong, it's Bosnians in Minnesota, within the metro area. also in other municipalities, rural municipalities in greater Minnesota. And there is a need for inclusion, which I think is what we're discussing, but there's also a need for representation, for identifying and arguably dialoguing, conversing with those future leaders so that they can engage that process of transformation with those individuals and those communities who are starting to undergo that change. You know, it is not just a matter of, you know, social transformation, it's a matter of economic livability. It's communities remaining and staying vibrant and being able to sustain urban and rural economies, which will make specific locations livable. And that's the question. You know, it's who's going to be working, who's going to be leading, and how can we start to manage this change? It's a very hard question because I think we've been used, particularly at least in Minnesota, and granted, my whole life I lived in states which were very different demographically, so that's my bias I have to put on the table. But, you know, it's a very homogeneous picture, and that picture, given what we're seeing in the data and the demographic data, will change and will definitely bring a whole set of new questions. So are we prepared for those questions? Because otherwise, what is the other option, right? What is the other option? What does the other option look like? I don't know what the other option looks like.
Thank you. I think that that's a really great note to end on. We've gone a little bit over time, and I thank everyone for hanging with us. Again, this webinar has been recorded and we will be available. You will get the link in a couple of days. I want to give a heartfelt thanks to Fernando, Meg, and Michele. Your presentation, I think, created a lot of fruit for great conversation and future work on this whole topic and theme. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. This was great.